Dr. Nick Brodie has come out all the way from South Hobart to talk to us about using Trove. It's a long way and it's cold. Nick is an historian, an archaeologist and a writer. He's the author of several books, including Kin, 1787 and the Vandemonian War, as well as numerous articles and essays. He specialises in both late medieval European and colonial Australian history. And if you think that's a bit of a muddle, you're right. Has appeared regularly on television and radio and is currently the Dean of Academic Studies at Jane Franklin Hall in Hobart. Could you please welcome Nick Brodie?
Well, thank you. You all may have laughed, but I was sitting at the Richmond Arms having dinner a short while ago, feeling very smug as I saw news of Hobart being gridlocked, because I left South Hobart a little bit early. So, distance and time are quite relative. It's a great pleasure to talk to you today about working from Trove. Can I just ask, who's used Trove previously for research? So sort of roughly half. Here, who's used it for advanced research? Like a lot, like serious Trove users? Okay, all right. You guys might need to get yourselves another drink because the paper will improve if you're otherwise occupied. I'm thinking very much, so Alan approached me in a South Hobart cafe to deliver a talk about using Trove, and he was framing it about maybe researching your house. And I've sort of run with that as my theme. So as we move through substantively, that's what I'll be talking about. But what I'll be trying to do as I do this, and mea culpa, this is the South Hobart history you're going to get in a minute, is to show you my ways of thinking about Trove, because I feel really quite privileged in a way to have come of age as a historian at the very dawn of Trove. Trove has completely changed the way that we do Australian history. We have, without doubt, the best freely available research tool for history on the planet in the form of Trove. It is just a phenomenal resource. The tremendous volume of material that is there, we're talking hundreds upon thousands of millions of pages and bits of metadata, and it's just constantly growing. So it's this ongoing project. And as I shifted from doing purely medieval research, which is obviously very much manuscript based, there is no easily tap in database to find the things. You have to spend hours in archives looking for evidence of locks for poor boxes, which was what I did for weeks just to prove whether or not the law had been obeyed. And when I started doing Australian history with Trove, you could just tap something in and bang, up it comes. You know, not only that, but I've just completed the history of the RACT, for instance. And I like quipping that the difficulty with that was balancing the book, because in the early part, where there's a rich newspaper resource available at my fingertips through Trove, I could find too much information, whereas some of the later corporate stuff was a little bit difficult. So in the early days, I would quip, you know, literally, there are expeditions of the early RACT where they went on a picnic, and I can tell you what they had for lunch and who was there and who'd made the sandwiches. Now, that's the sort of level of detail that Trove can provide. But that immense resource also brings with it, I think, a fascinating methodological horizon. And you've heard that I've done a spectrum of history in my short career. And what I think of myself as is less a historian than a methodologist. I'm really interested in the method, the mechanics of history, how we work out what we know and how to bring that to an audience. And so that's where Trove is really fascinating for me, because it's not just about finding stuff. You can find lots of stuff really quite easily, and you can dump it in textbooks pretty much verbatim, and there's a certain cohort of people that will read them. But if you're really going to reach beyond that, if you're going to reach to people who are not as passionate about Troving as you need to think of different ways of doing it. And also, from a research perspective, you need to think about innovative ways of doing it. Like, how do you make yourself the uber Trove person? And really, that's what's driven me in a way. I've thought about that a lot. So to give you a really good example of the classic Trove is when I did Kin, my first major book, which is a history of Australia told through my family tree. So Trove was a phenomenal resource for that, obviously, for connecting people. And there's the story of Joshua Higgs, who's one of my early ancestors who gets off the boat. He's a convict and has a pretty undocumented life. But I can tell a fantastic story about him because at a certain point late in life, he marched into the newspaper office in Bega and demanded that his story didn't get told. And the newspaper didn't print it. So he went to the next newspaper office and demanded that it be printed, and they did. And so there was his story written up for me. But more interesting in a way to me than that story, with the details of getting off the boat and going and doing the cattle thing, and he's the first person to find Talladega, and etc., is the fact that he went to 2 newspaper offices determined to tell his story. You know, that's a little bit of character there. That's the sort of stuff that I love looking for. So as I start to tell you some urban history, really, for the next 20 odd minutes, I want you to think in the back of your mind about those sorts of stories, the other things, the peripheral stuff that comes out of Trove, because that's where the really exciting stuff happens. For those of you who've never used Trove, again, apologies to the experts in the room, but this is the landing page. If you just Google Trove, the word Trove, it will be the first thing that comes up in an Australian search engine, and this is what it looks like. Trove is the National Library of Australia's repository of online information. It's basically a giant connected database. Now, the part that is most useful for us historians is really the newspapers section. So what I suggest that you do after you've landed on the page is you just go straight to the advanced search and select the newspapers and gazettes option. That will take you to this more advanced page for inputting data. Now, I left South Hobart, as I said, a little bit before the end of work. Now, this is my workplace, Jane Franklin Hall, where I'm the Dean of Academic Studies. This is our website. This is the image. This is the building called Barrett, which is sort of the lovely heart of the college, which gets used in all the marketing, which is why it's there on the landing page. This is the building that I'm going to talk about most now, because it's been one of my projects recently, is trying to get to the history of this building for the purposes of work. So apologies for all you Richmond people, but we're going to be very South Hobart focused for the next few minutes. But this is the building that we're most focused on. Researching a building is very much like researching family. You start with what you know. So you start now and work backwards. So now, Jane Franklin Hall, that's the bit that I know. This building is occupied by Jane Franklin Hall. You can just do a very basic search here, tap in literally Jane Franklin Hall, bang, and you will get a wealth of resources. Now this is the first tip for those who've never used it before, because you will get lots of resources, lots of nice little stories here, newspaper articles about the administration of it, etc. But you will also get the death of Jane Franklin, and not the famous one. This is much later, somewhere in northern Tasmania. And in fact, if you can read that, there's some over 165,000 Jane Franklin Hall hits. So the way around that is to narrow it down. If you put it in quote marks, it comes up as an exact search. So that's the key tip number 1. When you're searching something, start with the quote marks. If you're not finding anything, then broaden it out and just do the trawl. But otherwise, you've just got too much information. I think also narrow it down by place. So you see I've selected Tasmania there. You can select individual newspapers if you like. So if there is a Richmond one there, then you will be able to select that and search only that newspaper. And that, of course, makes everything much more manageable. We only end up with 100 and something from memory stories about Jane Franklin Hall, and the majority of those will be about Jane Franklin Hall. Because of the way that the search engine works, it focuses on optical recognition, matching that against corrections, because there are people who go through and correct the text. It's never perfectly accurate, but it's extremely powerful tool. Now, down in the bottom right-hand corner, you will notice that I've also circled images. When you're coming to write the history of your house, then you'll become very interested in images of it. And so you can select that, and that narrows the search down dramatically, and you will see that all of a sudden you've only got a handful of images. And here we have images of people at Jane Franklin Hall, including an image of somebody in Jane Franklin Hall. Best of all, we also have an image of Jane Franklin Hall in its early days. This door has now been walled up, So this is actually quite useful for me now in terms of helping to tell the history of this building. And that's just from a newspaper from the 1950s. Now, again, for those who've never used Trove, be warned, the newspapers only go up to 1955 or 6 at the minute. That's the cutoff point. There are some outliers that start in the 90s and go on. Canberra Times, I think, is one of them, and a few local presses, but for the most part, most things stop in the mid-1950s. So you've really got to focus on that time frame as what Trove can do for you. So working from Jane Franklin Hall backwards, I knew the story of Jane Franklin Hall. It was founded by the Tasmanian Council of Churches as a college for women in 1950. So I used those parameters to narrow things down much more carefully to try and work out who owned the building immediately before Jane Franklin Hall was founded. And of course, you start to find stories about the founding of it, which gives some lovely little details, like the address. Now, of course, the curious thing is Jane Franklin Hall is currently 6L Bowden Street. It is not 308 Davey Street. And here's another little tip for doing the particularly in an urban setting, house research thing. Street addresses change. This is a really frustrating, infuriating part of researching it, but they do. So they change over time and you've got to be very alert to this, but it's a good starting point. So tap in 308 Davey Street and you get much more manageable story. You get instances of things that are happening in the 1940s at this property. And here you can see Garden Fete for the Red Cross. This is a mid-war charity hub, you know, the sort of social activities that are taking place. You saw the image of the building to start with. It's a bit of a mansion, so you're starting to build up that picture. This is the well-to-do people on the hill having fundraising activities during the war, and that itself, I think, is a lovely part of the history. You can also then narrow down by date and type. When it comes to researching properties, advertising is your friend. Because that's often where the dates are printed to start with. So very rarely would articles have, not dates, sorry, the addresses. Rarely would articles print the addresses unless it's germane to the story. But advertisements have them all the time. So here we have the American Tea at Mrs. A.B. Cunningham, 308 Davey Street. And of course, then we can find stories about that event, although this one, I'm cheating. This is actually a couple of years early because they had a lot of these sorts of things and these ones had the date. You can see I've also found the person, Dr. A.B. Cunningham. He's an ice specialist living at this address. So this is the house of a medical professional and is part of that professional circle in Hobart. And you can then, I'm going to take you sideways for a minute. If you look at the results page on Trove, you'll see I've been focusing mostly on newspapers and gazettes, and that's where I spend the vast majority of my research time. But there are these other headings, which it's well worth delving into occasionally. The newspapers and magazines section and books and things can give you other funny little tidbits of information. So here we have the registered ophthalmologists, a gazette or whatever it is, and opticians, and Dr. Cunningham's there. You know, so you can find further information in that other element of Trove. But I think it's worth thinking of that very much as a side route that you do rather than the main thing, because it's very easy to get lost there. So back to the house. With a little bit more searching, you find more of those stories about the property being sold and turned into a college. Whenever there's a change of ownership, whenever there's a change of use, that's when you're most likely to get documentation, and that's what I'm focused on. Now here, of course, a lovely photo of the building, which is just fabulous for us because it has changed so much. Unfortunately, there's a rather unattractive mid-century extension going one way, off to the right there, and there's a later extension on the left which has blocked out most of the property. So using the building itself to tell the story, the classic archaeological way of going in and looking at which bit is built first, is a bit tricky in a building like this that has been painted many times. It has extensions. So unfortunately we're stuck sort of with the documentary history at the moment. But you can see that is that that building right. Like, we're definitely talking about the right one, and it's always a great confidence booster when you find a photo and you know that you're on the right page because you see the thing that you recognise. Also, as you start to get more stories, so we've just dealt with an address. Can anybody see what I found and just made me jump for joy? We found a name. So again, you can do that thing where you search for the property, Camboree, which sends me down another rabbit hole. As we start to find advertisements of the sale of this. So this is 1948 or 9 from memory, I can't quite see here. But it's the sale of this property, and then it's purchased by McCann's. Yes, those McCann's, the musical McCann's. But I suspect something may have gone awry because a couple of months later it's sold again, and that's the point that it goes to Jane Franklin Hall. But either way, those advertisements often tell you a lot. So if you see the advertisement, you'll notice there's a lot of detail about the property there. Any large property is going to get that. Sometimes also when they're for rent, you will see the same thing. And if you're certain that you're dealing with the same property over a long period of time, those advertisements can tell you a lot about how the property changes. So I've written a history of, again, with my family, rural properties. You can chart the addition of outbuildings, stables, etc., room divisions, those sorts of things by using these advertisements. In the absence of much other material, it at least gives you something to work with and some way of framing the structure of it. Again, for those first-timers, a really useful tool once you've started to get used to searching is to shift from the automatic relevance function. So it basically identifies what the algorithm thinks what you most want to see and puts that up the top. And most of the time that will be the most useful, at least the first couple. But there will come a point when you're starting to really look for more detail and you really want to trawl through in chronological sequence. And so you can sort from oldest to youngest or youngest to oldest. And I usually go oldest to youngest and then just go through methodically year by year by year because that helps you build up the story. So doing the same thing with this address, one of the earliest things that I found here, I think it's 1907, is actually a donation from proceeds towards a children's hospital coming from that same address in 1907. So that's jumped multiple owners, almost certainly, at that point. But again, I'm getting that sense of what this house is about. This is a house that is connected with the wider community, that is charitably proactive and is contributing to the development of Hobart. So you can see how I'm starting to build up a history, a sense of this place, even just from these limited sources. Did anybody spot the problem before I circled it? Other than my wife, who always spots my problems? You'll see, yes, you'll notice that the address has changed. The address hasn't changed, the street name has changed, just to complicate things further. Now, I have the advantage of having grown up in the town of Junee in country New South Wales, which was long known as Junee since the 1840s, 50s, after Junee Run, and then at a certain point the government tried to gazette it Loftus after the governor, and it just didn't stick. So for a few years it was Loftus, and then it went back to being Junee. So I grew up with the idea that yes, towns can change their names and people don't run with it. Streets can too, rather unfortunately, which makes it complicated. So Camboree at Holbrook Place, because then you start to scratch your head and you're thinking, am I talking about the same house or just the same name? Fortunately, in this instance, there's enough evidence to link it. You can see that the same family, the Peacocks, are occupying the same property and they're using the alternate addresses. Can you see the next problem? Now the address has changed. So we've gone from 308 Davy Street to 308 Holbrook Place to Davy Street, Holbrook Place, 234 Holbrook Place. You can see how frustrating this is. Even, I think, the newspaper printers got confused because here, of course, you have 234 Holbrook Place and 234 Davy Street as contemporary instances of this same property. Again, it's that fluidity of the past. We sort of live in an age where we're very used to the idea that you live at 6L Bowden Street and you always have, and that's just not true. You know, like people in the past, numbers, it doesn't matter, you know, it goes to, you're right, Mrs. Smith, then it'll get there. It's just the right sort of area. So that's where this sort of wider contextual stuff is really quite handy, you know. Even if we've got the possibility of it being the wrong house, we're still building up a picture of the peacocks. The peacocks like having American afternoon teas. And we can see them doing that at Davy Street and Holbrook Place, 234 or whatever it is. You know, you build up that sense. And that is part of the history of the house either way. Because even in the instance, the occasion that you will get where people do move houses and they take their house name with them, you know, if you know that property, even for a little while, that is still part of the house history. You know, and that just builds up a picture of those people living there at that time. And here, I think this is, again, one of the wonderful things about this particular building is that it keeps coming up in this same context. It keeps coming up in Red Cross fairs and society connections, really. And these early ones, I think, are the 1910s, 1909 and 1914. So again, now we've got two wars with the charitable Red Cross appeals taking place there. And we've got an industrialist who's got connections with Tonga. And having spent a few hours recently handing out jars of jam as part of a marketing exercise for Jane Franklin Hall, I was quite amused to find that there's jam manufacturers there in the background too. You also get those key life events, and sometimes those are ones which tell a really poignant story, such as this one. You all read it? Yep. So World Wars I and II were dreadful for Australia, but they were brilliant for historians, because this is the kind of thing that you can cross-reference really well with other documents. So if we went up and looked up young Mr. Peacock's service record, then we would find the address written down in his attestation papers, most likely. You know, again, we would sort of firm up some of those connections. They're the kinds of things that you can do going beyond Trove to do. In the 1920s, before the crash, the property seems to go on the market again, and this is where I'm still working on this history, so I haven't fully worked it out, but you can see Canberra there in Holbrook Place, and it's another one of those descriptions of the property. But either it didn't sell or the peacocks didn't move out, because they're still there afterwards in the 1930s, as we can see here. And that's part of that slow stitching that you have to do when you're researching properties. It's building up lots of detail and getting the connections just right. It takes quite a long time. But again, keeping an eye to the phases of the building's history. And so I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but you'll see there on the right that Canberra is basically a tennis location. And Canberra becomes the name of a tennis club, or a very small tennis club, you know, Canberra versus Wera School or whatever. And you see it changing for a little while in the sort of tennis's glorious moment in the mid-20th century, and you see that a lot. So it's again part of that changing social times. Right, we're going to go sideways again, because now it's time to talk a little bit about the pictures. Because it's at this point that I started to wonder if I could find any pictures. Now I'm starting to build up a sense of, you know, the Peacocks and then the Cunninghams, and there's these Fates and so on. Could I find any pictures? And the short answer is no. But again, pictures is just another one of those tabs that you can go to access to find things. I did find nearby ones. So this is across the road. Lovely photo, which is why I'm showing it to you. And it bears no relationship whatsoever to what I'm talking about, other than proximity. But it did remind me of some other research that I'd done, which I can use to tell you just a little bit about how to use pictures. Down the other end of Jane Franklin Hall is another property fundamentally. So Jane Franklin Hall started in 1950, just up there at Barrett, Camboree, that we've been talking about, and then it extended later in the century. And part of that extension was to take over the Allports property. Yes, those Allports. And so we have lovely gardens, and there was the Allports house there, but that got knocked down to make room for a car park and a large student accommodation. But the only thing that survives is what's on the screen in front of you, which is a fish pond. Side note, this fish pond was used from the 1840s to transplant fish from Europe to Tasmania. So some of the perch that are here came from that very pond, because Mr. Allport got them off the boat and he put them in that pond and acclimatised them and then tried to put them elsewhere. Not salmon, unfortunately, although he was very involved in that, nor trout, although he was very involved in that, but some of the lesser fish did go through those ponds. But in looking at the history of this site, I was just like moth to flame with this pond, because this is just such a cool story. There's so much, and I'm again not going to go into it, but Mr. Allport, sadly, and we're not telling the students or parents this, there's a child that drowned there in 1850, so there's quite an inquest, there's quite a write-up about this. It's one of those things that has a lot of detail, and the ponds are an important part of the property story because of that connections with science and progress, and that's quite a cool connection for a university college to play on, obviously. But I really wanted to try find a photo of it. And so I spent a lot of time searching Trove for images of the Allports, searching on the Allports, each one's name individually, the property, any adjacent property, even just looking at pictures of that area of South Hobart, zooming in, trying to find it, and didn't quite achieve it, but did find some lovely images of the site. So this is the site as drawn by one of the Allports in the 1840s. And I did manage to find an image of the house that was destroyed. So this is the kind of thing that you can find in this part of Trove, and particularly if you've got a large, well-to-do private residence, or you're talking about a public building like this one, then you will almost certainly find something in that area of Trove to do with it. But back to Barrett/Camboree, because I wanted to keep going back. So it's like the family history thing, you know, you're on the trail and you want to find the first person. Who got off the boat? And with the house, it's who built the house? And to do that, you have to slowly creep your way back through the newspapers. And fortunately, occasionally, so when I did kin, because of a family dispute, I was able to leap a couple of generations really quickly because of a court case that was written up and described the family relations for me in shorthand. I'm like, booyah, straight back to the 1800s. So managed to do a similar thing here, where I lucked on this story that has the address right, it's got the connections right, and it refers to it being built by the late Mr. Crawford Maxwell, and it's lately the resident of Mr. Peacock's. And the time matches up, so I'm very confident that we're talking about the right person. So I thought, gotcha. Start searching for Crawford Maxwell. Do you think I could find him? So this is currently where my research trail ends at the minute. There's a little bit further on, but it's a bit too complicated to try and describe. But as you can see, I'm trying to match, this is my brain thinking, matching up the Crawfords maps, the CW, the CM, are we talking about the same person, 76 Davies Street, and then down the bottom you'll notice that there are two different property names, and so I'm scratching my head thinking, is this a previous name for Camboree, or are these other adjacent properties? One of them, since doing this slide, I have worked out is in fact an adjacent property, seemingly given to the daughters or something, just to frustrate me many years later. But these are the kinds of things that you have to do. But again, it's just that connections. You will notice from the kinds of articles that I've got there, the sorts of things that help you do it though. And again, they build up a picture. Wanted a cook, wanted a good plain cook. Somebody died. Somebody has a son born. It's the everyday advertisement stuff that is just so phenomenally useful for researching the history of houses. It takes a bit of time, but once you've done it, you really do get a good sense of the history, the person. So my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Hanson, Peter Hanson, living in Balmain, he lost his dogs a lot, you know, and you know that because he's always offering rewards for dogs in the newspapers. I don't know much else about the man, cannot find where he was born, but not very good with dogs, evidently. Because that's such a mess, I'm going to close with a brief survey into the final gem in the Jane Franklin Hall architectural repertoire, which is the building we now know as Weber. This is a residential property on Elboden Street near the main gate entrance, which is currently occupied by, tends to be the postgrads or senior students living in a sort of share house arrangement, but still part of the college. And it was acquired in around the 1980s by the college, so we have pretty good provenance because of that. But I wanted to look into the history of it because there was just only this general sense that it's a bit of an Art Deco building, and it's a lovely building, as you can see. Beautiful stained glass in it. And of course, it doesn't take long once you narrow down the address and the details to build up a picture. Again, here we have a building named Koyama, tapping into that inclination towards all things Japanese at some point in the 20th century. This is from the sale in the 1940s, working my way backwards very quickly through the name Koyama. I could get to 1924. Lovely description of a dance, you know, the sort of jazz age social that's taking place. You can see how it fits into the neighbourhood. There's that strong sense of socialisation, but it's a different sort of thing. This is much more a residential house that's looking in, inviting people in. It's not really the charitable powerhouse that's up on the hill with the stately home. With this one, I did manage to track it back through Trove to the actual building and found a report of the architect. Now, this is the one you really want, because once you've got a named architect for a building like that, its value goes whoop. Especially when you get double confirmation of that. So these are articles separated by a couple of years. One's describing the building being built, the other one's it's just been built, again referring to the same architects, Ricketts and Hayward. Does anyone know their architectural history? No? Sort of. So these are the guys who built this. And you can see the little dome there up the top. You know, there's echoes of that. And so you can see my principal rubbing her hands when I told her this news. This is value's just gone up. But of course, it's not the only reason you do this research. This is about learning how to tell stories, and so hopefully my walking you backwards into the past has helped you to get a sense of how my brain works as I jump through the links. You try to connect the details like you do with a family history so that there's generational change. When do the owners change? During that, what are the cultural threads that this place represents? Is it a charitable powerhouse on the hill? Is it a jazzy place down the hill? And from that, then I think you're well placed to tell the story of your own houses. And so thank you for listening to me, and I'm more than happy to take a few questions if anybody wants them.